As therapists who are trying to remove trauma using the brain's natural way of doing this through memory reconsolidation, one of the things that we're trying to find is mismatch information. And what I'm going to cover in this short video is how we can do that using scaling questions. Now, a scaling question is a question that is built around a scale. So you'll have a scale, say, from 0 all the way up to 10. And so you'll ask a question around this scale. And it's a great way of finding out opposites to what the client believes, basically. It brings in other elements of the story. So let's say a client wants to be, let's say they want to be less angry. So let's say the problem they're bringing in is they're angry a lot of the time, and what they'd like is to be calm, maybe assertively calm, but still calm. And then they might say, the problem is I never do that, and this is how I'd like to be instead. Their belief then, in terms of how they are, it can very easily go into kind of a black and white thinking. And so what the scaling question does is it just asks that question. It says, okay, so let's just assume that 10 is the thing that you want, where you're calm yet assertive. And 0 is the furthest thing away from that. Where would you put yourself on this scale? Now, of course, sometimes people will say 0, but it's quite rare. So they might just say something like, oh, I'm quite a way away from this. I'm probably about a 2. Or they might say, well, maybe I'm a 4. Now, what that allows you to do, let's say they did say 2, because that's right, or let's say they even say 1. There is something going on in between the 0 and the 1. Or in between the 0 and the 2, or in between the 0 and the 4, if they've said that. And this bit here is quite juicy, because this is where the mismatches are. Maybe not all of the mismatches, but certainly a whole bunch of mismatches are here. And so you can follow up the scaling question by asking, what puts you so high? Even if it's a 1. What puts you at a 1, say, rather than a 0? And what happens here is that the client is then able to then start digging into the opposite story. Now, memory reconsolidation, what the brain needs is opposites. That's why we dig for mismatches. Sorry, this should say 0, of course, not zoo. So we're looking for mismatches because we're looking for these opposites. And so when we ask what puts you at a 1 rather than a 0, they're then able to dig into the grey areas. And so rather than just viewing themselves as an angry person, there are other elements to the story. Well, I'm at a 2 because I can often talk myself down. And you can even start digging into things like, give me some examples that show that you're a 1 or a 2 rather than a 0. And then people can start painting in these situations. Well, the other week, for instance, I had a dispute with a colleague and I didn't get angry. This happened instead. So it's a different way, really, to ask that question that we can often ask to find mismatches of tell me about a time. But the reason why it might even add a lot more to that is because when we ask a scaling question, what we can often dig into is what's right with you. And by amplifying those strengths of what's right with you, we can often find important mismatches. So for instance, if someone says, nobody likes me, I'm a very unpopular person, and that's their story. You might say, what would you like to be instead? And they'd say, well, I'd like people to be liking me, and I'd like to have access to friends. And so once you've got that information, again, you can say, so where are you at the moment? 10 is where you've got all the access to friends that you want. 0 is the complete absence, like the total and utter absence of that. Where are you at the moment? And so if they were to say something low, like a 1 or a 2 here, again, you've got all this good stuff where you could say, well, tell me about this. Tell me about these things where actually people are showing that they like you. Tell me what puts you at a 1 or a 2 rather than a 0. And then people can get into, well, such and such always looks out for me, or I was in this situation and Fred came over and helped me out. And so you start to build simply by digging into what's going right. You start to build alternative experiences, mismatch experiences to the old story. And so if the old story is nobody likes me, and that's impacting their life, then you have these alternative stories where people did seem to demonstrate that they like them. And then once you've got this mismatch stuff, of course, you can then start generating these juxtapositions that we talked about before that lead to memory reconsolidation. So just a quick summary to finish off. One way of coming up with mismatch information, mismatch experiences, is to ask a question around a scale where 10 is the very thing that they want, 0 is the furthest away from that, and ask them where they are at the moment, because sometimes they'll say 0, but almost always they'll say something higher than a 0. And even if they just say 1, there's a whole load of juice here where you can say, so what puts you at a 1 rather than a 0? What's going on here that's close to the thing that you want, that has an element of the thing that you want? And then you can dig in to that story.